Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Mary Baker Eddy Library. My name is Leslie Pitts, and I'm the Executive Manager and President of the library. Strength of spirit, engaging with Mary Baker Eddy 100 years later. It doesn't seem possible that we started this series of programs 9 months ago, and now here we are in our final months. And we do hope that you will be here with us in person or online for the library's last 3 presentations. In this centennial year of Mary Baker Eddy's passing, we've looked at how writers, philanthropists, movie directors, and playwrights are engaging with her life story and her words. It's true that many today do not even remember her name and only have a superficial knowledge of her achievements. But our hope is that by the end of this year, many more will be introduced to her and to see how her ideas are still part of the conversation in the world around us. Her conversations with Bronson Alcott started in the 1870s, and tonight we'll learn a little more about this interaction and a lot more about Eddy and the Alcotts. Her ideas and writings challenge perspectives in the traditionally male-dominated provinces of science, theology, and medicine. And those that heard or read about them were either incensed at her presumptuousness to question established theory, or their interest was piqued enough to delve into her writings and engage with her. Bronson Alcott did the latter. Information about future and past events in this series is on the library's website, mbelibrary.org, for viewing or listening to on your computer. Now, if you don't get enough of tonight's panelists, and for those of you that watch this program online, John Mattison and Lisa Stepansky will return for a web forum on October the 28th at 2 p.m. And that will be available through our website, where you'll be able to submit questions by email. And please join us here in the Hall of Ideas for our next program, New Visions in Social Change, on November the 4th. A distinguished panel will examine the new phenomenon of the social entrepreneur and discuss what shapes our global society today. This program will be at 7 p.m. and online registration is now open. So let's welcome Jonathan Eder, our library's program producer, up with our panelists and give them a good warm welcome.
Well, again, welcome. It's always an adventure for us to prepare these programs, and I want to give you just a little sense of the background of what goes into what we're about to experience this evening. We have to sort of think about the topic and do our own research here at the library. And for us at the Mary Baker Eddy Library, this particular topic, I think, has been particularly meaningful because we work with Mary Baker Eddy, we work with her ideas, her life story on virtually a daily basis. And it can lead us to kind of take it for granted in a way, become familiar with it. And what is really truly extraordinary becomes ordinary because it's part of our everyday experience. But in looking back at the Transcendentalists and looking at their thought and their writings, it is such a vivid reminder of the vitality and the vigorousness and the boldness of thought that was taking place here in 19th century New England. And it reignites for us that divine spark that the Transcendentalists are so fond of talking about and thinking about, of awareness, of just how radical and bold Mary Baker Eddy's thought and ideas were, and really still are. So I really appreciate the work that you two have done to hold that mirror up to that period of history and remind us here at the library of just what courage and what dedication was involved in enunciating and articulating those ideas. You know, in some ways, it almost seems like a contradiction in terms to say that we've planned a program on Transcendentalism. The more you read the
joke, isn't it, Jonathan?
Yeah, an inside joke. Yes. The more you read the Transcendentalists, the more you get the message that life should be spontaneous, and it is the flow of the moment where true inspiration and true illumination happens. But tonight's going to be really a combination of the two. We do have a plan, and I'll share it with you. We're going to begin with our two guides that are going to bring us back into this era, and then we're going to open it up to a panel discussion, and then have audience questions for the last third of the program. As you can see, there is an empty seat up here, and this is in the spirit of Transcendentalism. They were always open, ready to welcome the itinerant guest. Yes. And as some of you may know, that was often the case with Bronson Alcott. He traveled around sharing his ideas throughout the country. So there it is, and we'll see if someone shows up. But let me begin by introducing to you my co-panelists. Immediately to my right is John Madison. And John is an acclaimed author. His book, Eden's Outcasts, the story of Louisa May Alcott and her father, won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. Was that 2009? 2008. And John has a new book that will be coming out shortly next year called The Lives of Margaret Fuller, who was also another eminent transcendentalist. John teaches English at John Jay College in New York City, and he has spoken and written on Mary Baker Eddy and Bronson Alcott and other important 19th century American thinkers. And then to my left is Lisa Stefanski, and Lisa is very well known to us here at the library. She's been a fellow here twice. We have a fellowship program in the summers, and she is writing on Mary Baker Eddy and Bronson Alcott. And she and John have both participated recently in the teaching series in the institute that takes place at Orchard House, the home of Louisa May Alcott in Concord, Massachusetts. So we're delighted to have both of them with us tonight. And John, why don't you just get us started and let us know what brought you to this topic and into this arena of scholarship.
Oh, well, Jonathan, thank you very much. I'm not quite as brave as Lisa, who comes without meticulously prepared text because she doesn't need one, but I'm afraid that perhaps I do. So I have some remarks. I want to thank you, first of all, for the kind introduction. I want to thank you, too, for just the kindness that you and the staff of the library have shown me, and in bringing me up here, and everything has just been top-notch, first-rate. Really appreciate it a great deal. And thanks to all of you for taking time this evening to spend 90 minutes or so with us. For me, the study of Bronson Alcott and the Transcendental era has been a perpetual act of homecoming. My parents, Tom and Rosemary Madison, were lifelong Christian Scientists. Although my own affiliation with Christian Science ended in my early 20s, I've always been drawn to the writers whom I regard as the intellectual forebears of the Christian Science faith: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, and of course Bronson Alcott. Throughout the pursuit of my doctorate in English, when it came to studying the Transcendentalists, I had the pleasurable feeling of enjoying an unfair advantage over my classmates, because steeped as they were in the materialisms of Karl Marx and the sensualisms of Sigmund Freud, my colleagues, it seemed to me, seldom quite knew what to do with the remarkable band of thinkers and writers who walked the roads and paths of Concord, Massachusetts during the American Renaissance. They had trouble taking seriously the idea that visible reality was not the ultimate truth of our existence. They seemed either impatient with or dismissive of the concept that there might exist a divine mind beyond the human, or that transcendent truth, as opposed to wealth or power or sex, might be the true mainspring of life. But for me, who had learned to recite Mary Baker Eddy's scientific statement of being, which you may know sets forth the core of her spiritual philosophy, before I knew the Pledge of Allegiance, Emerson, Alcott, and Fuller felt like a second skin, within which I could always move with freedom and confidence. In my mind, their concerns felt like current events, and their spiritual force was very much alive. Now, I'm certainly aware that important distinctions need to be observed. Bronson Alcott never called himself a Christian Scientist, and Mary Baker Eddy was no Alcottian. Nevertheless, Alcott and Mrs. Eddy perceived portions of the same truth, and it gives me tremendous pleasure to help illuminate some of those perceptions with you this evening. Now, having said this, I should note that my interest in Bronson Alcott grew out of a more immediate desire than a quest for spiritual enlightenment. I was most motivated by needs related to family. When I began my work on Eden's Outcasts, I was the father of a bright and extremely verbal 7-year-old daughter. My study of the American Renaissance led me to understand Bronson Alcott as an exceptionally committed father, deeply dedicated to understanding the intellectual and emotional natures of his children, including his own verbally gifted daughter, Louisa May Alcott. It occurred to me that I could learn to be a better parent by writing about a father-daughter relationship. At the same time, I suspected that my own experiences as a father might enable me to read between the lines of the Alcott family letters and journals and make some inspired guesses about the feelings and even the strategies that lay beneath the surface of those communications. If I may say so, my plan seems to have worked pretty well in both directions. Bronson Alcott helped me to understand a number of things about parenthood, including the importance of listening to and respecting the ideas of one's child. But the most important point of which he reminded me is that a child is a spiritual being. Alcott believed that, being so recently arrived from the celestial realm, children are naturally closer to a divine state of being than those of us who have had longer time to be distracted and sullied by the ways of the world. He regarded children with the most pious reverence. At home and in the schools that he founded, Bronson Alcott wanted to create environments that would respect the innate goodness of children and would allow them to grow up, in his words, quote, comparatively pure and spotless, unquote. Alcott thought that if children could preserve their original moral natures, they might, as adults, become living, quote, principles of undeviating rectitude, unquote, whose strong and loving examples might help to reform all of humankind. So proceeding from this premise, Bronson Alcott structured his home so that his children would receive only pure and improving influences. He believed that he could, quote, like the divinity, exert a special oversight, unquote, over his children, and thus guide them toward a perfect spiritual formation. Now, Bronson's faith in the innate purity and perfection of children was, as almost all parents will agree, a little bit exaggerated. And he was actually surprised when his two eldest daughters, Anna and Louisa, quarreled in the nursery and otherwise acted other than as the little paragons of virtue that he supposed they were supposed to be. Because he expected so much of his children, his theories seemed to fall apart when he put them into practice. Nevertheless, Alcott saw, however imperfectly, what Mrs. Eddy might have called the true potential of man. His entire career emerged from his confidence in the attainability of perfection. Now, another careful distinction has to be made because Bronson Alcott started from the premises of a human body and a human mind, and he believed that one could manipulate the stimuli of the physical world, the right surroundings, proper teaching, the correct and always vegetarian diet, so as to extract perfection from matter. Mrs. Eddy, to the contrary, maintained that materiality was an illusion. She argued that whoever would seek perfection must begin with perfection. That is, with the confidence that the spirit of man was always and already a reflection of a perfect God. But I don't think we should tax Mr. Alcott too much for failing to anticipate in toto Mary Baker Eddy's theology. Elizabeth Peabody, Alcott's assistant at his Boston Temple School, said that Alcott was really claiming nothing more than that, and I quote, "Spirit exists." Simple sentence, a subject and a verb. But that statement, "Spirit exists," contains within it a mighty and wonderful truth. Mrs. Eddy used that truth to demonstrate to her followers that fear and pain and death have no reality. Bronson Alcott, for his part, suspected that these miseries of the human condition did exist, and yet he was also confident that because spirit exists, fear and pain and death really don't matter so much. Because spirit exists, we can look past our fears, and we can outlast our sorrows, and we can realize that the everlasting answer of the universe is not a no, but a yes. Now, this panel's been called Radical Times, Radical Minds, and as Alcott and Mrs. Eddy both knew, it's good to remember the true meanings of words. Radical, as some of you probably know, derives from the Latin word radix, or root. We call the square root sign in mathematics the radical for this reason. Now, Mr. Alcott and Mrs. Eddy were alike in that they both desired to get at the very root of things. Aspiring highly, they also knew how to dig deep. At the root of humanity, Bronson Alcott saw the soul of a child, desperate to be reminded that it is good and that it is loved. At the root of theology, Mary Baker Eddy beheld the perfect idea that God is all in all. She would have agreed wholeheartedly with Alcott's statement, quote, "God is revealed to a human being by the measure in which he apprehends the divinity of his own soul." To paraphrase Patrick Henry, if I may, if this be radicalism, make the most of it. I'm going to close shortly, but I will do so by asking your brief indulgence, because my final words tonight actually don't have to do either with Bronson Alcott or with Mary Baker Eddy. My mother was 87 when my book on the Alcotts, Eden's Outcast, was published, and she had a surpassing love of Christian Science, which she studied almost every day for as long as I can remember. And I think it's possible that learning that my book had been chosen by the Christian Science Monitor as one of the outstanding biographies of 2007 meant more to her than its later receiving the Pulitzer Prize. And I have no doubt that if she knew that I was here tonight in the Mary Baker Eddy Library, she would have been filled with a sincere and surpassing pride. And it's a sad thing that she didn't actually remain with us quite long enough to see this day, because less than 4 weeks ago, she closed her eyes for the last time. Now, the faith that had sustained her for so long, I want you to understand, enabled her to leave the mortal world without a single fear of death, whose supposed power she disdained, and with a knowledge that she had done the work that God had given her with earnestness, creativity, and skill. I began my remarks by stating that my appearance here this evening has been an intellectual homecoming. That return is, I think, insignificant when I place it alongside the recent translation of Rosemary Madison, who has now permanently come home. Thank you.
Well, Leslie, we'll have to get John a badge so he can get in at his convenience, since you're now home again. It's great to have you back. Well, Lisa, I forgot to mention that, like John, you're also a professor of English at Emmanuel College, and that's really what's brought you here to the library to pursue your scholarship. But we'd love to hear more about it and your investment in this topic.
Great, thank you. Well, I first want to take this opportunity, as John did, to thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me tonight to speak to everyone, and also to the library staff and to the library in general, Leslie, on behalf of all your wonderful staff. You've supported me in my research for the last 2 years, the library has, and it's been a wonderful journey, and I'm very grateful for that. And I'm very grateful for establishing this connection, too, between Emmanuel, which is just 20-minute walk from here, and the library. So I see a lot of fruitful connections coming out of this, and I'm appreciative. And I'm very honored also to be on this panel with my good friend and colleague, John Madison, who I've known for a long time now through our talks at Orchard House in Concord on the Alcotts. And your remarks, John, really remind me, I think, why I think I resonated with you early on, because we both had, I realized early on, the same take on the Alcotts. Especially Bronson Alcott, who had been rather vilified as a result of a biography in the 70s that kind of made him out to be this kind of almost a demon, kind of autocratic weirdo, essentially. And that never sat with me very well. And in thinking about that, I mean, I do think also that all your research is autobiographical, that you filter as a historian, as for me, a literary historian, you filter it through your own perspective. You can't get outside of, contrary to what perhaps Mrs. Eddy might say, your body, or at least your perspective when you're doing your work. And a friend of mine once said to me when I was writing my dissertation on the Alcotts, she said, well, Lisa, you're kind of living what you're writing about. I was writing about their family, and I was writing about Bronson, especially as a teacher and as a father, really. And I realized, too, that I think that I thought of him very much the way I thought of my own father. And my own father was the father of 3 girls. He used to say even the cat was a female. And 3 rather strong-minded women, and his wife. And my father was always very, very supportive of me. He actually read my entire dissertation, and the only comment he had was, you use a lot of commas. But I always took that as as heartening to me. And so kind of, filtering out Bronson through my own, that lens of a father-daughter relationship. In my case, it was the daughter, kind of thinking about what is it that you do to children that grow them in a certain direction. And certainly my father's support was always there for my education, and that propelled me, I think, in significant ways, as I think it propelled Louisa and Anna and all the Alcott daughters, because they always had their father's support. They always knew that he believed in them, and the significance of that. So that's kind of a roundabout way of acknowledging John and the impact, really, that to find somebody who was thinking of the Alcotts in similar ways as I was doing. So it's wonderful to be here with you and to hear your own kind of perspective on it. And also, I just want to acknowledge, too, the wonderful stewardship of the people at Orchard House who have sustained both John and I in our scholarship through the institute that Jonathan mentioned, and Jan Turnquist in particular, the director of Orchard House, who's done really a marvelous job of stewarding the Alcott legacy for all of us, not only rescuing literally the house from falling into itself and doing significant repairs and fundraising for that, but also, more importantly, to stewarding the Alcott's intellectual and artistic legacy that obviously I think so many of you appreciate and know so well. So that's my long thank you, Jonathan. But now to Mary Baker Eddy and to Bronson Alcott and the subject of our panel and kind of what brings me here tonight and how did I get here. My scholarship revolves around literacy, education, 19th century in particular, 19th century women writers, and obviously the Alcotts. And I have had a fascination with the Alcotts since I was about 10 when I first read Little Women, and I bet lots of you, I see people nodding, had a similar thing. And when in the 70s when I was reading her, very few of her novels were in print. So the only way to read her other work, and there was a lot of other work besides Little Women, I quickly found out, was to haunt used bookstores. And there was one in my hometown of Manchester, Connecticut, that I haunted for years, just collecting children's books and Alcott books in particular. And that kind of was my early introduction to the Alcotts. I came to the Eddy Library 2 years ago on a fellowship through the Alcotts. Through a series of kind of serendipitous events, I found out that Bronson Alcott, written to Mrs. Eddy, had corresponded, and so I came over. I proposed a fellowship project where I would kind of investigate that relationship, and so that's what I did on my first fellowship. I am I'm not, it's a little embarrassing, I suppose, to say I've been teaching at Emmanuel for almost 30 years, and I never set foot into this building until 2009 to begin that research, and it was the beginning of what has really been, as I said, a really fruitful relationship. So that first summer I looked at Alcott and Eddy, and that led me into Mrs. Eddy. I didn't know really anything about her other than I did go to Boston College. I knew her house was in Chestnut Hill. That was about it. That was about the extent of my knowledge. And just that introduction, I kind of realized, wow, this is a really interesting person. I read the Gillian Gill biography, which maybe some of you have read, which is a very recent one, which is really, it introduces you to Mary Baker Eddy as this really remarkable cultural figure. And I got very interested in her and, you know, how she built this complex, you know, how she created a movement that is with us today and very much alive. And I was also rather interested in the fact that many scholars have really not paid much attention to Mary Baker Eddy. As Leslie pointed out at the beginning, she's really been marginalized, and she continues to be. This was Bronson Alcott, I think, until John, and more people have looked at the Alcotts and really brought them in to the scholarly limelight, but not so much Mrs. Eddy. And I think part of that has to do with her, as with Bronson, being labeled a kook, an eccentric, somebody whose ideas, you know, didn't make sense to people. I'm always wary of when we start to write people off like that. I think those are the people often that are at the beginnings of movements, and we need to pay attention to them. And when I realized the remarkable accomplishments of Eddy outside of her religion, I was even more interested in it. Now, I am not a Christian Scientist. I'm a practicing Catholic. And again, I think I filter things through that lens. And part of what I think about with Eddy is her as a woman religious. At the Catholics, we have women religious as well. There are 3 female doctors of the church. There's Teresa of Avila, there's Teresa of Lisieux, and there's Catherine of Siena, of all the doctors of the church. And they were important spiritual leaders for Catholicism, and they wrote, obviously, and they were women writers as well as women religious. They're perhaps not as well known even to Catholics as the male doctors of the church, like St. Augustine, like St. Ambrose, like Thomas Aquinas. So that kind of drew me to her. I've also always been very interested in religion in general, and women practicing religion. And then on top of this with Mrs. Eddy, she's a woman writer. She's a 19th century woman writer. So she kind of fits all my research agendas very conveniently. And I've been kind of looking at her in all of those different ways. I'm also interested in rhetoric. John and I both teach writing, so we're very interested in language and the way rhetoric is influenced by culture, the way culture influences your rhetoric. And certainly all cultures and religions in particular, and the expressions of religion are culturally shaped. I mean, Jesus spoke in agricultural parables. Why? Because that was the language that his audience understood. So I became interested in the rhetoric that Eddy was using, her perhaps appropriating perhaps a rhetoric that was not womanly or not considered really the natural language that women would adopt. I thought that was a pretty remarkable accomplishment. So I'm gotten interested in Christian Science as a cultural movement and its relationship to Transcendentalism. As John was pointing out, Christian Science evolves, it comes out, it just doesn't come out of anywhere. Eddy is influenced by her congregationalism, her reading as a child, the sentimental culture that she's immersed in, her own personal story, her motherhood. There are, I think, many factors that feed into Eddy and her writing and her teachings. And so basically what I've been doing in these last 2 years is trying to unpack some of that and to kind of trace those origins and look at Mrs. Eddy as both a cultural figure and look at the movement that she founded as well. And I think, do I see a visitor out there? The Oversoul? No? Do I see another woman writer
I
out there?
don't want to intrude. I'm sorry, I was looking for Mrs. Eddy.
Mrs. Eddy isn't here, but we would certainly like you to come in, Miss Alcott, to talk a little bit about your experience with her.
I'm not intruding.
No, not at all, not at all. Come right up here. We have a seat for you. We have a seat for you.
I was looking for Mrs. Eddy. I'm Louisa May Alcott. And my father, hello, good evening. My father, Amos Bronson Alcott, good day, sir, has a message for Mrs. Eddy. Have any of you seen Mrs. Eddy? She is not here?
This is a very good place for a message for Mrs.
Oh,
Eddy.
so perhaps I could just pass it along then, if that would be all right. Do you know my father, Amos Bronson Alcott? He has started to dream more intensely than ever now of starting a school of philosophy and literature. He and Mr. Emerson. Do you know Ralph Waldo Emerson? Yes, they together have this dream, and I think that anyone with ideas as stimulating as Mrs. Eddy would be interested in this school of philosophy idea as well. My father and Mr. Emerson are transcendentalists. Do you know of transcendentalism? I will assure you, oh, I see that. I will tell you that if you have a room with 10 transcendentalists in it, you will then have 10 definitions of transcendentalism. I myself have often said, why try to know the unknowable when there are mouths to be fed and people to be clothed? It is not exactly something that has ignited my passion in the way it has ignited my father's and Mr. Emerson's. But they are concerned with the oversoul and believe that each of us may find a direct connection to that oversoul, especially if we go through nature. Father has often said, up through nature to God. Now, Mrs. Eddy, as I'm given to understand from speaking with Father, is not truly a transcendentalist, but an original thinker and someone who has ignited my father's interest and passions. Father has always been open to anyone with a philosophical or spiritual idea to share. I like to say Father has never discarded anything. He started as an Episcopalian or Anglican, if you will, in Wolcott, Connecticut. He heard Lyman Beecher preach in the Second Great Awakening and was then most interested in Congregationalism and Presbyterianism. And his parents allowed him to visit these denominations. Father has gone on to be interested in Swedenborgianism, all of the Eastern writings. As you see, never discarding anything. Do you know, recently there are plans to build an Episcopal church in our town of Concord, Massachusetts, and I suppose at this juncture you would say that we are more inclined to Theodore Parker's preaching. If you've heard Theodore Parker preach, the Unitarian Church, that is more where we would be inclined to be found today. However, my father has determined he will make a generous contribution to that Episcopal church being built in Concord, Massachusetts, never discarding anything. But Father has a wonderful thing to say. This is Father's letter. I know he won't mind. He's very open about such things. He is writing to thank Mrs. Eddy for the wonderful volume, Science and Health, which she sent to our home for Father to read, and he read it with great interest. He writes that the interest has peaked, and he wants to add that the perusal has awakened a great desire to know more about her personally. Father says, the sacred truths which you announce, sustained by facts of the immortal life, give to your work the seal of inspiration, reaffirm, in modern phrase, this Christian revelation. In times like ours, so sunk in sensualism, I hail with joy any voice speaking an assured word for God and immortality. And my joy is heightened the more when I find the blessed words are of a woman's divinings. But I need more space than paper allows to speak discriminatingly of yourself in science. May I assure you, that has always been the case with my father. He asks if he may then inquire if she would deem a visit from him an impertinence. If not, and agreeable, would she name a date when he may expect a fuller interchange of views on these absorbing themes. I think Father and Mrs. Eddy will have a great deal to talk about. Father, perhaps more philosophically oriented than Mrs. Eddy. I must say, from what I know of her, I feel quite a kinship for the practical side of things. I see these philosophers sitting about waiting to speak to Father, and I say they look like hens roosting for corn. Father, my mother has said, is like a man in a balloon, ever wafting upward with these high ideals. But someone has to hold the ropes, keep him from floating away altogether. Mother and I have taken that task upon ourselves. Mrs. Eddy, I think, is a bit more of that practical ilk as my mother and I are. But her ideas have truly inspired my father. And I know when they visit, I would really enjoy being a little mouse under the table, perhaps, or a fly upon the wall. Perhaps we could arrange such a visit. I would like that. Do you think we could? Father and Mrs. Eddy? That would be interesting. So. Yes. Well, I don't know if any of you have occasion to see Mrs. Eddy soon, but if you do, would you tell her that I'm going to leave Father's correspondence with someone who will hopefully give it to her. And finding such dress reformers here amongst us, I must say I like to see such forward-thinking people, ladies, in pantalettes. I will say you are the sort of people I would like to meet again. Might you perhaps come and visit in Concord one day? I must warn you, I get a little porcupiney about strangers coming along, because ever since I wrote that book, Little Women, people come seeking my autograph. They knock on the door. Oh, is this the house of the Little Women? Might we come in? And they're halfway through the door. I had 28 applications for an autograph last week. I wrote a little poem of all sad words. The saddest are these. To an author's ear. An autograph, please. You can't get a blessed thing done. So I will tell this little secret to you if you promise you won't reveal this now to anyone. I can trust dress reformers, can't I? People after my own heart. Well, when I see someone I don't recognize, and as memorable as you are, I'm afraid when I meet you again, I will look at you as if I've never seen you before. I run to the kitchen when I see these strangers coming along. I put on an apron. I get the flour canister, put a little flour upon myself so that it looks like I've been baking. And then I go to the front door and wait for the knock, which I'm sure is going to come. And as soon as they knock, oh, you're here to see Miss Alcott, are you now? I'm sorry to tell you, Miss Alcott's not at home. Good day to you. But I don't want to do that to you if we should meet again. So you'll remind me you're the very nice people that I met when looking for Mrs. Eddy. Good day to you.
So John and Lisa, do you think we can help kind of convey that idea of a meeting of Bronson Alcott and Mary Baker Eddy? Capture a little bit of what that interchange, that exchange of ideas
We'll do the best we can.
would involve. But before that, Lisa, I'm just curious, what do we know and what can we speculate about in terms of why Mary Baker Eddy would have sent Science and Health to Bronson Alcott? She didn't know him before then.
No, she didn't. And from what I understand, she sent the book to a number of people, number of men, rather prominent writers in the Boston area in 1875, 1876, when she first published it. I think that in and of itself kind of speaks to who Eddy was. I think a very practical woman. She had written this book She obviously wanted to get her ideas out in the public, and she also realized she needed kind of a stamp of approval, or she was seeking that, certainly. She was seeking some kind of response, a review or a statement about it, and seeking some endorsement, essentially, from prominent people. This kind of speaks to women writers in the 19th century. I mean, when she's writing in the 1870s, obviously many women, Louisa May Alcott, Harriet Beecher Stowe, have paved the way for her. But there's still this notion, I think, around women and language and public language, things like that, that require perhaps, or would be forwarded by a man's kind of approval. And I haven't really found the smoking gun per se, but I think she obviously must have known about the Alcotts. She must have known about Bronson, and I suspect that she felt there would be indeed some sympathy, some kinship between them and their ideas and their thoughts, and indeed there was.
And what do we know about their actual exchange once they did become known to one another in terms of correspondence and meetings?
Well, they met a few times. They corresponded. It was not for very long because Alcott's wife, I believe John, at this point was ill, correct?
Abba died in 1877.
Yes, so that kind of curtailed it as well. At that point, too, Eddie was starting to be involved in some rather litigious lawsuits, legal problems, and things like that. People have speculated that it might have been because Alcott was having to tend to his wife who was dying. Also that perhaps he was a little wary of getting involved in her because he realized that she was a public figure at that point. She was going with her troubles, and that he didn't want to get involved in that. But they did meet. I believe, if I remember correctly, he might have addressed her students at one point. I think I remember reading about that. So there were some face-to-face meetings and some exchange of letters.
Well, welcome. There's something very familiar about you.
Did I miss? I missed Louisa again, didn't I? This keeps happening. Was she here? Did I miss her? Yeah.
So welcome. If you could just tell us a little bit about who you are. And
Well, I am Jan Turnquist, Executive Director of Louisa May Alcott's Orchard House, and have found the fascinating family of the Alcotts have led me on all sorts of adventures. People ask me, since I've been highly involved in research and activity in the house for over 30 years, they say to me, "Aren't you sick of the Alcotts by now?" And I say no, because they are a window into utterly fascinating areas. Not only the history of the time, but the various philosophies. And Louisa, of course, was a wonderful feminist. And there are just layers and layers and layers. It never stops. And they seem to know everyone. John and I especially love the phrase, "in the army of reform." Louisa said she never knew less than a general. So they knew everyone. And I just am fascinated by the wonderful people I get to meet, too. Both John and Lisa have been wonderful friends and scholars and very active. We love to do programmatic things at Orchard House. It's not just saving the house.
yeah, no, you do wonderful things. I've been out there. The School of Philosophy that Bronson Alcott founded is alive and well out there. Well, as some of you may know, Bronson Alcott was extremely fond of conversation. Perhaps he distinguished himself in no other way more than as a conversationalist. And in many ways, that's how he is best remembered. That's when he shined the brightest, was really in conversation. And so we're going to, through the writings of Alcott and Eddy, create a kind of virtual conversation between the two. So we're going to get started with this virtual and imaginary conversation. I will read Bronson, and Jan will read Mary Baker Eddy. And if you look to this screen, you'll see Alcott's quotation, and to that, Mary Baker Eddy's. "Spirit is all in all. God, man, nature are a divine synthesis, whose parts it is impiety to sunder."
Man and woman as coexistent and eternal with God, forever reflect in glorified quality, the infinite Father, Mother, God.
So these two ideas, these two quotes, Jan and John, what do they tell us about their respective perspectives and how they're aligned and how they might be different?
Well, in 1850, Jonathan, Ralph Waldo Emerson published an essay on Montaigne, which was included in a larger collection called Representative Men. And he observed in that essay that there are two ways of looking at the cosmos. One that emphasizes multiplicity, and another that stresses unity of all things. And it's interesting to see that for both Bronson Alcott and Mrs. Eddy, it was unity that was ascendant. Being, as a concept for them, was either already unitary or was striving toward a kind of oneness, a oneness between past and present, between human beings and the natural world, and ultimately between man and God. So Emerson referred to the difference between unity and multiplicity as sort of the tossing of a coin. But with Alcott and Eddy, it always seemed to come up heads.
When I read these, especially I look at Mary Baker Eddy, and it kind of reminds me of her theology as a very kind of gender neutral or gender inclusive, maybe is a better word, that the Father, Mother, God, when I read this especially, I kind of think about her theology and the way in which she kind of posits a God that is not male, but is male, participates in both the feminine and the masculine, and in that regard, I think is very forward-thinking for her time, certainly. And that idea, too, that men and women they're coexistent, they're eternal with God, they're kind of on the same plane, and that she seemed to really embrace that was a central part of her thinking. That's when I look at this, and especially that's what I think about in this conversation here.
One thing that I think is interesting to contrast between the two is that Mrs. Eddy focuses very much on the human, as you say, Lisa, male and female human, but human and the divine, whereas Alcott really does think that God, humanity, and nature are inextricably linked. And I think his focus on nature is one of the ways that the Transcendentalism shows through, because that was so key. The Transcendentalist way of finding the spiritual is through nature.
All right, the conversation continues.
Human capacity is slow to discern and to grasp God's creation and the divine power and presence which go with it, demonstrating its spiritual origin. Mortals can never know the infinite until they throw off the old man and reach the spiritual image and likeness.
Man is a rudiment and embryon of God. Eternity shall develop in him the divine image.
Interesting again. I said a few minutes ago that Bronson Alcott and Mrs. Eddy both believed in unity, and they did. But it's clear that they also believed in a capacity for progress. And the idea of a progressive universe is one that's rooted very strongly in German Romanticism, which is one of the stronger precursors of American Transcendentalism. This notion that not only humankind, but all of creation is on an upward continuum and following an upward momentum to a higher consciousness, a higher awareness, a nearness to God. Now, Alcott believes in this kind of progress, but for him, progress is also a return, because as human beings progress spiritually, he sees them as actually coming back to their divine origins. That's why the child is so important to him, that he believed, as I said in my earlier comments, that childhood was the state in which human beings were closest to God because they were so recently arrived from the celestial region. And it seems to me that Mrs. Eddy, too, perceived the geometry of life as based not on something linear, but rather on a circle. That in Christian Science, you don't discover a new identity of man, but rather you become aware of what man has divinely been all along. So that's a thought.
Yeah. Anything jump out at you?
Well, I was just thinking about, kind of with both of them, the way in which they value the spiritual. That what strikes me, and when I teach, I always try to relate what I teach, because sometimes it's easy to get, the Transcendentalists are these old people from the 19th century. Who cares about them? My students are, having trouble connecting them to the relevance of today. But I look at these two writers, and I think about how they valued the spiritual as a way to make meaning. I mean, we live in an age that really wants to dichotomize between science and technology on the one hand. I find it a little troubling that even our president is saying everyone needs to focus on science and math. And we haven't talked about the humanities and the value of that. And that I think both Eddy and Alcott really are pushing against in their what in their time is an increasing kind of materialism. I mean, things are really starting to take off. In 1876, that's when Alexander Graham Bell patents the telephone. It's the first public display of electric lights. In America, we're pushing towards the modern era, where science and technology is kind of, I think today we even see that, is seen as kind of, it's one or the other, it's exclusive. And I think for believers, and when I say believers, I'm very inclusive in that term, but people, that Alcott and Eddy are believers. They believe in something that's out there, as well as the progress that you talk about, John. There's something else that can give meaning to life, and that, it's kind of a call to remember that, and to kind of say that the spiritual coexists. The spiritual is a way to make meaning that's important, and we don't want to lose sight of that. And that to me is a lot of what I think they're trying to do in their writings and in the way they live their life. Their insistence that the spiritual has its relevance and value.
The other thing that is close to what John was saying, but I just want to add Bronson's wonderful quotation where he says, "Children are fresher from God." That's very much what you were just talking about, and this German romanticist idea that the child is father of the man. Well, that's not German, but same idea. And I look at Mrs. Eddy's line where she says, "Mortals can never know the infinite until they throw off the old man." Well, even though she doesn't say child, you think of what is the opposite of the old man. And who is, in the romanticist view, the father of that old man? It's the child from which he came. And I think there's an intimation of that in Mrs. Eddy's quotation.
And Lisa, what you were saying about technological progress is really interesting as well, because Emerson and Alcott, at least initially, saw technological progress as a sort of metaphor for the spiritual progress of man, and were, I think, a little bit astonished when they began to realize sort of the soullessness of the machine, and that things are going on by clank rather than by poetry. Yeah. And Alcott, people unfortunately don't read Bronson Alcott anymore. He's not a great writer, but he's a very thoughtful writer, and he has a book called Tablets that came out the same year as Little Women, in which he really can't make up his mind about technology, because on the one hand he's really rooting for it, but on the other hand he wants to retreat to his garden and have everything be sort of pastoral and Augustan forever. So it's a really complicated question for him.
Yeah.
Let's continue. We see thought as it springs from the soul, and in the very process of growth and utterance, ideas stand in beauty and majesty before the soul.
Mind is not necessarily dependent upon educational processes. It possesses of itself all beauty and poetry and the power of expressing them. We are all capable of more than we do. The influence or action of soul confers a freedom, which explains the phenomena of improvisation and the fervor of untutored lips.
I've been noticing, Jonathan, that a lot of the quotations from Bronson Alcott come from something called Orphic sayings. And it's really very interesting that we've come back to Orphic sayings as a sort of a touchdown for our discussion, because I don't know how many of you are aware of the history of Orphic sayings, but they were published under Bronson's name in the first edition of the Transcendental magazine, which was called The Dial. And there were a lot of people who took pot shots at The Dial, and at Bronson in particular, because Orphic sayings was the only thing in the entire magazine that was actually connected with someone's name. Everything else was anonymous. And someone said about Alcott's Orphic sayings that it was like looking at a 15-car train with only one passenger. And someone in one of the Boston papers published a parody called Gastric Sayings. It was all about upset stomachs and crazy things like that. And yet, you're sort of conditioned if you study literature to laugh at Orphic sayings, but then you actually read them, and you realize that there's some real depth to them. I'm struck by the fact that that Alcott says that thought arises not from the brain or even from the mind, but from the soul. And as many of you here know, Mrs. Eddy treated the mind and soul as perfectly synonymous, and she regarded both words as synonymous with God. Now, I think when you start to entertain the idea that mind and spirit are identical, then theology ceases to be just a collection of ideas. It becomes real, it becomes soulful, it becomes a part of you. And it becomes so infused with other aspects of being, emotion, passion, belief, thought, all of these things flowing together. It becomes a lot more persuasive, a lot harder to resist than when it's just a collection of dogmas. And I think that's part of what Bronson was thinking about.
I can't resist sharing with everyone what I shared with this group before about Bronson. He was absolutely charismatic as a speaker. And Emerson said that Alcott was the foremost genius of the day because of his original thinking. But Emerson also said, why is it that when Mr. Alcott writes, he gives you the chaff and throws away the grain of his thought? And I think that explains why, of course, it's fun to poke fun at something like that. But if you take the time to dig a little bit, as we're doing here, then you do find, through all that chaff, there is something really good in there. It's just unfortunate that he couldn't find a way through writing to do what he could do verbally, orally.
And I actually love Bronson's journals. You go to the Houghton Library, you get the original volumes, and they're captivating. But so little of them are published, and it seems to me that he was better writing in private than he was in public. If it was just writing for himself, he could relax a bit, but the public stuff's a little tough going.
Well, that reminds me also, I think the connection here, too, of them as writers, I think part of it is, Eddy had a lot of she had a lot of criticisms leveled against her in writing Science and Health. Mark Twain, her most well-known critic in 1907, you may know, wrote an entire book called Christian Science, and he basically, he's alternately amused, perplexed, vexed, annoyed, and fascinated by Eddy, who he calls, kind of one of the most significant women of his era, and he does level a lot of criticism about Science and Health, which Eddy obsessively rewrote for her, once, from the 1870s until almost to her death, in endless editions, et cetera, revising her ideas. We were talking about this, that I think, they both, if we think about them as writers, and that's kind of one of the connections that I see, but she was very intent on the revision process, perhaps knowing too that she wanted to get her ideas out there in public. But both of them did endure a lot of criticism about their styles, that they were, too philosophic or too kind of wordy or whatever. But as I think you make a great point, John, that when you really start to look at them, you realize that there's a lot of weight to those ideas, and you have to kind of see through the criticism that was leveled at them.
All right.
Willingness to become as a little child and to leave the old for the new renders thought receptive of the advanced idea.
there is in the deep mind of a child a power of virtue, which the influences of nature and providence develop and manifest.
Well, I'm thinking about Alcott as teacher, certainly in Bronson Alcott's classrooms. The book that I've been working on the Alcotts, I spend quite a bit of time looking at correspondence between Bronson and a very young girl named Elizabeth Lewis that he had as a boarder and as a student at the Germantown Academy that he ran. And then there's letters, there's journals, school journals of a brother and sister who has attended Temple School, which was his kind of most famous school experiment in Boston. And I think with John and we've talked about this, he's a very progressive educator. He's the things that we take for granted now, kind of open learning, children reading from actual books, kind of staying away from rote memorization, but rather asking children to write journals and things like that. These are all, for us, we take it for granted that our children are going to get this, particularly in grammar school, but that was quite the opposite in the 1830s when Bronson is actually engaged in teaching, when he's actually making a living as a teacher. It's all about rote memorization. It's all about kind of sit down, do what the teacher says. If you don't, you get whacked on the head or you wear the dunce cap. And Alcott really believed that in that deep mind of the child, that his job was to kind of pull out that wisdom that the child harbored. And his pedagogy, his own teaching methods, when you look at the things he did, he also in the Temple School, he introduced things like a little school library. He made sure that the room was very inviting and open. And you think, oh, well, that doesn't seem so odd. But when you realize in public education in the early and mid-19th centuries, it wasn't very well funded. Do we see any parallels to today? The schools were often very dilapidated. Do we see any parallels today? They were usually in the part of town on the land that nobody wanted. They didn't farm it. There was kind of a real, this idea that the school was not this inviting place to be. And Bronson Alcott, in his own pedagogy and his own approach to the classroom, was really quite modern in that regard, and also in his approach to respecting children and to actually being rather curious about what they might have to teach him, which is a relatively modern thing.
And actually very shocking for the time. And I think it's important to realize not only everything that you said, but really think about the context. You could say, as you listen to all of that, well, people had to try some new ideas. No, they actually thought that if you did not beat the child, they took that biblical imperative very seriously. If you spare the rod, you spoil the child. You are doing something absolutely damaging to that child by refusing to beat that person. And that's something that Bronson refused to do. If you allow questions in the classroom, that's almost even worse, because children should be seen and not heard. They should sit there, as Lisa was saying, for rote memorization, then stand up, recite the lesson, and sit down. If you pipe up with a question, you're insulting the teacher. So for Bronson to not only just introduce those precepts, but then, as you were saying, Lisa, the underpinning of it is believing that the child brings you wisdom. And Bronson wrote at one point, the child, that the teacher should study the child. The child should become the book for the teacher. Bronson was superintendent of schools in the 1860s and was training teachers and trying to influence them in these ways, and people were just floored by what he did. And constantly he was being told he had to change his ways, and he just wouldn't do it. So he paid a big price.
I mentioned earlier regarding the roots of the word radical. Bronson Alcott and Mary Baker Eddy both believed a great deal in the importance of knowing what words really meant and knowing where they came from. My mother, when she studied Christian Science, told me that the second most important book you could have after Science and Health, well, the Bible, I suppose, but was Webster's Dictionary, because you could go back to the dictionary could really tell you what a word meant. It could help you with your scientific practice. But one of the words that really mattered to Bronson Alcott was education. And education comes from a Latin root. The Latin root is educare, and it literally means to draw out, to educe, rather than to inducate, which would be, I suppose, to cram the information in. Now, I don't know if you can ever draw out a quadratic equation from a student. You probably have to put some things there. But the parts of education that Bronson most worried about were matters of spiritual education, the things that were, he thought, innate and intuitive. And so, indeed, much of his educational practice was Socratic, just trying to find what his students knew. And particularly with regard to spiritual matters. If you're familiar with Conversations with Children on the Gospels, Bronson spent a lot of time simply trying to find out what a child's take was on the Holy Scripture.
Which also got him into a lot of hot water.
A huge amount of hot water.
Yeah, I think Mary Baker Eddy found that in sharing her discovery and revelation with children, that they often were more tractable, that they understood it and were able to practice it more quickly and more effectively than adults. Adults took longer to put her healing practice into effect.
One of the things as I'm thinking about this with Eddy in particular is thinking of her also through the lens of being a mother, but a mother who experienced a profound separation from her child. She was, Eddy married very young. She and her husband moved to the Carolinas. He died while she was pregnant and penniless, and had to come back home. Had her son, her only child, had to give him up to another couple who then left and raised him in Minnesota, very far from her. She wouldn't see him. That was 1856. She didn't see him again until 1879, when he had been a soldier in the Civil War. He was a grown man at that point, and her relation with him, if you've read biographies of her, was a strained one, as you could imagine. He really, and yet I think that idea of mothering and motherhood was very important to her, and the idea of a child. Even though she herself was not able to raise her own child, she was a mother. And I think about that a lot, again, kind of filtering that maybe just as a personal thing, kind of thinking of, because part of, I think, the fun of these, of your research is, we do think of these people as real people. We were talking, Jan was saying that, it's too bad with Bronson that we don't have a videotape of him, because he really does seem to be the kind of person that this is how he connected with people, not necessarily through his writing, and made a profound impact on people, but kind of thinking about these historical figures in a very personal kind of way. And I think a lot about that with Eddy. I think, you can't, those are life experiences that shape you in very significant ways, and that profound loss that she must have experienced. And really that sense of powerlessness for her, because of course, if you read Jane Eyre, you read any of these novels in the 19th century, if you're a kind of widowed, penniless woman, or just penniless woman, period, you really don't have a lot of options. And that, to me, is also kind of what's remarkable about her story, is that she got out of that position that for many women of the time would not be a position that they could easily get out of.
Disease and misfortune are memoranda of violations of the divine law, written in the letter of pain and evil.
Let us banish sickness as an outlaw and abide by the rule of perpetual harmony, God's law. It is man's moral right to annul an unjust sentence, a sentence never inflicted by divine authority.
When Bronson Alcott was 82 years old, after a lifetime of very robust health, he suffered a paralyzing stroke. But even after that happened, he kept his very strong faith in life and in health. One of the things you can read about in my book, I don't know if it's been mentioned, by the way, but we've got copies for
after
yeah,
the program.
Okay, very good. Yeah, okay. As he lay more or less helpless, one of the things that he said was, I'm taking a predicament. And it's interesting, I mean, his debility, he couldn't move half of his body, but it wasn't a tragedy for him. It was not an insurmountable misfortune. It was merely a problem to be worked out, just a problem to be solved. Sort of a temporary inconvenience, if you will, to be triumphed over. And I think both Alcott and Mrs. Eddy believed that the right idea, insisted upon with bravery, could conquer even the most seemingly daunting predicament.
It's interesting, though, because I see in Mrs. Eddy's statement such a strength. Bronson is commenting, it seems to me, and Mrs. Eddy is commanding. She's going to get that illness right out of here. And of course, that becomes the core of what distinguishes this faith, I think. But it's interesting to see that, because I think Bronson, you couldn't say, is far from that thinking, in the sense that he's making an observation that she would probably not argue. She would probably agree with that. But then she goes quite a large step further, which I think is very bold and very interesting.
Well, I think one of the distinctive aspects of her approach to healing was not to engage in diagnosis. To me, Alcott's quote here is a diagnosis of why there's pain and evil, why there's suffering. And Eddy felt that you had to go beyond that. If you started to try and understand the origin of the problem, you were going to get lost in the problem, at least to some degree. And that you had to take that commanding position, or otherwise you couldn't really fully go beyond it.
The thing that I think about with this, and what I'm interested in, is Christian Science as a healing movement. It's coming out of a culture, and reading a lot about medical history at the time in the 1870s is a kind of eye-opening. As one historian said, that particularly for women at this time, if you had the alternative of treatment with modern medicine versus spiritual healing, a spiritual healing approach, which was not invented by Mrs. Eddy by all means, but is kind of an idea that has a lot of currency out there. But this historian said that if you look at what those treatments would be, particularly for women, you would in fact, it would be a very rational choice to choose that path of spiritual healing, that medicine at that time was really quite primitive still, and particularly women, obstetrical cases and things like that. That's been an interesting thing for me, is to kind of think about the cultural context out of which Christian Science comes. It seems to me too, and again, I come from this as an outsider, so I'm not a Christian Science theologian, so but my reading of some of these things, it just kind of writ large, Mrs. Eddy on healing, is that she's kind of advocating, it's kind of a simultaneous taking control and letting go, that you kind of take control. I mean, that's what you're saying, I think, Jan, is banish sickness. That's being authoritative. That's being, you are in control. And yet it's also a simultaneous letting go into, as you were saying, Jonathan, kind of this larger power that's beyond the physical. And I kind of think of, for me, I look at kind of the language of Christian Science in kind of a metaphorical way, this idea that I also think, why is she so focused on healing? That to me is very an interesting question. And what is it why is healing kind of at the nexus of her thought? And I think, again, going back to this push against materialism, she's, pushing against, kind of the kind of modern ideas that are coming in, and kind of asserting that healing, that the modern world is making us ill. I mean, I think there's a lot of, a lot of scholars have talked about this as really anticipating what people just talk about afterward, the psychosomatic origins of illness, that illness is not just a physical thing, but it's something else as well. And I think certainly they're both interested in that. They're interested in the physical body specifically, but they're also interested in it's more than that, and your body is more than just your body.
Another thing that I just really want to comment briefly, we talked, or I think Louisa talked a tiny bit about Bronson being such a philosopher. Mrs. Eddy was much more practical, and it really shows here, because the philosopher is speaking in philosophical terms. Disease and misfortune are memoranda of violations. Do you know anybody who's really sick who'd say, yes, memoranda, That's a philosopher speaking, but she is practical. She sees people who are ill and says, let's banish that. God will take care of that because you have a moral right to annul this. You didn't ask, God didn't put that on you. So, you know, that practical side, I think that's kind of exciting, actually.
It is exciting. You know, I'm going to skip to the next one because we want to get you involved in this conversation. Love is divine, conceiving, creating, completing all things. Love is the genius of spirit.
Divine love always has met and always will meet every human need.
I'm so glad that we're ending with this one. Curiously enough, it doesn't make me think of Emerson or Wordsworth or any of the other people we've kicked around tonight, but rather the Beatle George Harrison. Back in 1987, the 20th anniversary of the much vaunted Summer of Love, George Harrison was in a documentary in which a lot of the sort of figures from 1967 were asked the same question, which was, is love all you need, based on the Beatles song, All You Need Is Love. And every single one of the people interviewed said, not so sure. Paul McCartney said, not sure what you need. Abby Hoffman said, you need justice. But then there was George. George was being interviewed in his library. He's asked the question. He says, just a minute. Goes around, takes down a book by Sir Walter Scott, opens up and reads. And this is what he read. Love rules the court, the camp, the grove, and men below and the saints above. For love is heaven, and heaven is love. And then he puts the book away and he says, that's pretty good authority for me, and I'm sticking with it.
That's wonderful.
Who knew that Bronson Alcott, Mary Baker Eddy, and George Harrison would be sitting here in great agreement with Sir Walter Scott?
I just think they're very beautiful quotes. It just reminds me and reiterates what you were saying, John, about, you know, that these two people really had some very profound and beautiful things to say. I think that these two quotes are really quite lovely. It reminds me of, you know, and that idea in theology, just in general, the power of love, which is kind of a cliched thing, but a true thing. You know, I think of one of my favorite saints is Saint Teresa of Lisieux, and if you know anything about her spirituality, it's all about the little way, and it's just love. God is love. It's the power of that, and it's an abstract idea, and yet it's a very concrete idea, and I think you see that in their lives and their thinking.
Absolutely. Well, we would love to hear from you. Any thoughts or questions? There's a stand-up mic here in the middle of the room, so please feel free to come up and address the panel with anything that you might want to inquire about.
I want to thank you all very much for the presentation tonight. I found it quite illuminating. A question has occurred to me based on the particular quotations that you showed on the screen tonight. And I thought that I would ask it since there are so many Alcott experts here tonight. I'm a lifelong student of Christian Science, and I have always been very grateful for the way in which science and health, the ideas that are encompassed in science and health, are embedded in the scriptures. Okay, Mrs. Eddy's revelation comes directly from the teachings of Jesus, and she often uses both Old Testament and New Testament quotes as well as paraphrases in her work. I don't see any examples of that in Bronson Alcott, and I would like to know to what degree did he use the Bible to develop his philosophy. The other thing I want to say is that concerning the importance of science and health, while a dictionary is certainly a good tool to have, I'm sure that Mrs. Eddy and no other Christian scientist would ever say that science and health is more important than the Bible.
Well, of course not. I did not mean to suggest that.
I might just speak for a moment to your question about how much did Bronson Alcott have, shall we say, be influenced by the Bible, and I'd say a great deal. He certainly read the scriptures. We didn't happen to choose those kind of quotations, but certainly, especially in personal ways, it's very evident. He, for example, in a letter to one of his children at Christmas time, he writes about the greatest life ever lived and talks about, 2,000 years ago, a child came into the world, that sort of thing. And I know that everything he read spiritually added to his thinking. So he would never limit himself to only the Bible, but he certainly was influenced by it and thought it was profound, important writing.
Bronson was deeply influenced by the Bible, but he also had a sort of more global sense of Scripture. And in fact, in the 1840s, one of the projects that he toyed around with after Fruitlands was actually to sort of rewrite a Bible, but to have it include references to the Bhagavad Gita and so forth, to make it a really more global, more encompassing document. I don't think he ever put pen to paper on the actual idea, but he wrote about it in his journals. And
I think it's very much the way he thought. He really...
Yeah, very much so.
This is why I like to say he never discarded anything. It never diluted for him, I don't think, the power of the Bible. He just kept finding places that reinforced what he had read there. Look, it says something similar over here and over here, which is another reason I think he was so open to Mrs. Eddy.
And it's interesting, too, on the subject of Mrs. Eddy, one of the complaints that a lot of people had about Bronson Alcott's mind was that he was so difficult to influence, that he tended to sort of cherry pick what he found in his reading and use it to support where he already was. And yet, if you read Bronson's book, Table Talk, which he published in 1877, a year or two, I guess, after his first contact with Mrs. Eddy, remarkably, he seems to have imbibed a little bit of Christian Science. We didn't use a lot of quotations from Table Talk, and yet I think, there we go, right, love includes all knowledge, etc. There's a lot in Table Talk that could actually have been taken from Science and Health, and there's a great journal article to be written about the influence of Mary Baker Eddy on the late period of Alcott's writing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that his work at the Temple School very much involved teaching about Jesus, didn't it? Trying to
The
learn.
Bible was used commonly as a school text,
Yeah.
and Bronson was no different.
Yeah. In fact, in his conversations on the Gospels, basically Bronson was taking the children through the Gospel according to St. Matthew and asking for their responses and input and discussion as to what the Scripture meant.
And I also know that he really thought of Jesus as a great teacher. I mean, rabbi, right? That's Jesus is called that, teacher, and that I think Bronson really took that to heart. The way Christ came as a teacher, and I think that inevitabas shaped his kind of pedagogical outlook.
And in fact, in the Temple School, over Bronson's desk, he had a large bas-relief sculpture of Jesus placed right behind him so the kids could sort of look up and see it above him. And
Which is which, right?
Yeah, well, and in fact, one day there was a kid who said, "I think you're a little like Jesus Christ, Mr. Alcott." And Bronson didn't correct the child. That was fine with him.
Yeah. Well, I think that also shows another connection is I do think both of these people had a very strong sense of ego and person. I don't think that they, as you said, John, that, that Alcott was hard to kind of dissuade or move from his position. And I think that kind of strength of kind of identity comes across in Eddy's life as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this presentation. And my compliments on the way you have presented the arguments. I think this is very unique. I've never seen this before, but it's very special. But I'd like to contrast, forgive me for not having a big notepad, but I was writing on my knee trying to capture some of these thoughts. And it's interesting, the contrast. Eddy talks about reflection, image, likeness. Alcott talks about eternity shall develop the divine image. That seems very distant and time-consuming, wherever that is. Eddy, man reflects God. And Alcott, man is the synthesis of God's nature. Very, very close, very, very close. Eddy, moral right to annul an unjust sentence. Divine authority, perpetual harmony. And Alcott, well, if you violate the divine law, you're going to have pain and you're going to have evil. That's his conclusion. And then the last point that I heard was Eddy was a practical thinker with a moral right. And what I heard was that maybe Alcott was a philosopher. So my question is, now Mrs. Eddy, in her book, uses the term absolute many, many times. That these are principles, and you could demonstrate it right now. You could prove it. And that was her healing mission. And in the last 100 pages of her book, just read the book, and you get a healing. Whereas, can you tell me, is there evidence of the manifestation of Alcott's thinking in any organized way? Did he come to absolute conclusions, as Mrs. Eddy did? Did he acknowledge Eddy's healing, the healing power of what she was teaching? And did he have something that was comparable?
I think not. He was always open and searching and thinking. But I would say the word absolute was much more lacking in his vocabulary. And as far as I have ever read, there was no sense of, this is how to be healed. Now I will, take that path. I think he was certainly not rejecting of it. There was never any, again, no absolute to say, I've read this over, she's wrong, too bad. Nothing like that either. Open, but not absolute is how I would read that. I don't know if my wonderful colleagues have any other-
I would agree with that. I think that I always think of Bronson as a man who's constantly kind of questing and as, kind of like an onion. He just keeps layering, all his knowledge on it. He doesn't discard, he just adds it. But I think perhaps that's where they differ. I think, for me anyways, Eddy does publish her ideas in Science and Health, and that in and of itself is an absolute, to say this is a textbook, this is the template for healing, essentially. And so I think that in and of itself kind of demonstrates to me that practical part. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, that I think is that is why we're here talking about her. Because if you don't kind of write these things down and get them out in the world, those, it's hard for your ideas to have currency beyond you. Alcott certainly was publishing and doing those things, but we could say that the reason why we're talking about him is because his daughter wrote something very practical and got it out, and then he was allowed to do that. But I think that's kind of how they differ in some ways. I think she did arrive at some absolutes that then she felt that she needed to share.
And to some degree, again, I see that as the difference between the philosopher and the practical. Sorry, John.
Well, no, it's complicated because when I think of Bronson Alcott, I don't think of a man who compromises. I think of a man who is willing practically to starve himself and his family to death on a utopian community. I think of someone who was absolutely staunch in his belief that the consumption of animal flesh was a crime against nature and God and every form of morality. In those senses, he was unbending. And yet, I have been sitting here quietly, as the other folks have responded, searching my mind, trying to think what sort of philosophic principle he really did treat as absolute and inviolable. Very difficult to pin down. Yeah. But so, a man of great staunchness in the way that he led his life But, and yet, you know, we talk about Bronson as a philosopher. The question then naturally is, well, then what was his philosophy? And it's a strangely elusive question.
Let me make this point, if I may.
Sure.
It seems to me that Eddy, in her reasoning, and I can't remember the Latin term, but I can remember the terms, QED, therefore it is proved.
Quod erat demonstrandum.
Good for you. Thank you. Thank you. I used to know that.
Turns out the crossword puzzle sometimes.
Therefore it is proved. And the last sentence of her scientific statement of being is the therefore clause.
Yes.
Therefore, man is not material, he is spiritual. And I gained a great deal of knowledge tonight, but I don't know if I gained enough to conclude that he came to something similar, and I think you've answered my question.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take one more question, or two, maybe two, if we can be quick with them.
About 50 years ago, Robert Peel wrote a book, Christian Science's Encounter with American Culture, which dealt with Mrs. Eddy and her relationship with Bronson Alcott. I'm interested in knowing what each of you think of that book. And also, I don't know if you have on the screen that you'll be using at the end, maybe Mrs. Eddy's tribute to Bronson Alcott in Pulpit and Press. I don't have the book in front of me, but I thought that would be a nice thing to refer to.
Well, I've read that book very recently. That was one of the early books that I read when in 2009, when I got my first fellowship. So I was directed by the research staff here to some, because as I said, I came here really knowing nothing about Eddy, so I needed to kind of learn about her. I read Gill's biography, and through her going back to Peel, who I know is a pretty well-respected student of Christian Science in academic circles, and I think that's important to know that, and from just coming at this as an academic, you need to look at the sources that are in front of you and see what your colleagues have said about the historiography or whatever the work that's been presented. And Peel, I think John would perhaps, I don't know, John will concur about that, but I know that he's well respected, a lot of access to materials and things like that, and presented, I thought, a interesting and lucid argument about that encounter, and that was the first and really the only piece that I read about it, actually, when I was really starting to search in databases and stuff. That was the only thing that I found. And then, of course, I read his biography of Eddy, which Gill herself acknowledges the kind of debt that she has to that, to her work that she did. But I don't know, John, if you've...
Lisa, I will sheepishly defer.
Oh, okay. You mean that was what? Yeah, you always worry about the books that they're going to ask you if you've read it. Oh boy. Yeah. I mean, the problem with that book is it's out of print, and so I mean, I had to go online, and so it's. But I actually found it a very helpful piece because he comes at Christian Science as a Christian scientist, and but that. You have to be careful about that, but as I said, we're always kind of filtering things through our own experiences, but I think he's very careful to also want to present it in a very in a historic light as a cultural phenomenon. And I believe he was a student at Harvard, and he wanted to be taken seriously as a scholar, so he knew that he couldn't be like me, just writing something just from my as a personal essay, but rather treating Christian Science as a cultural and historical phenomenon. So I found it a very helpful and very balanced treatment, and I think it's actually a pretty useful book for people who don't know anything about the connections that we've been talking about Transcendentalism and Christian Science and the emergence of Christian Science out of a particular culture.
Yeah, I don't remember. I know he referred to Alcott as the tedious archangel, wasn't that?
That's what Emerson
Yeah,
called
and-
it.
That's what Emerson.
Yeah.
But I'm sure he quoted.
Yes, please.
Just a quickie. I thought it was very interesting that you spoke about children and bringing out their knowledge as a way of learning for both Alcott and Mary Baker Eddy. And of course, we all know how much of a teacher Mary Baker Eddy was. But in the course of your conversations, someone indicated about how Bronson got into hot water. And I didn't know whether you know any short stories or short things that might be of interest, that how he got in.
Oh, so you'd like a little follow-up on that?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
we have
very
a
good.
lot of them.
Well, the story is this. Bronson reached the apex of his career as a teacher at the now destroyed Masonic Temple, which was very near Boston Common, at a school called the Temple School. And he ran that school with the assistance of Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, who went on to essentially found American kindergartens. It was a very progressive, revolutionary school. Ms. Peabody published a book called Record of a School that was the talk of New England. Everyone thought, oh my goodness, or at least the more liberal, open-minded side of New England said, oh my goodness, this guy is teaching in ways that we've never imagined before. It's fantastic. We are at the dawn of a new era. And then Bronson got a little bit too encouraged. He said, if that book went so well, I'm going to do another one. And I'm going to call this one Conversations on the Gospels, with Children on the Gospels. And the idea was he was going to take time out of every week in school and talk with the children about the Gospel according to Matthew. And of course, there are things in Matthew about conception and so forth. And this kind of got the conversation going with the kids. And Bronson sort of shaded into some areas that parents were sort of used to discussing with their children. Or not, yeah. And he was very...
Don't forget the Cabbage Patch
Yeah.
was very popular back then.
Yeah, and he was very respectful, very reverent about the way that he approached the topic, and yet there were observations that the children made. For instance, there was a little boy named Josiah Quincy, who was, I think, 7 years old, and he said, oh, I understand, babies are made out of the naughtiness of other people. And in 1837, the word naughtiness was enough to start a sort of, well, not only that, but the idea that Bronson would so blaspheme as to ask children what they thought about the scriptures rather than telling them what they should think about the scriptures. And Alcott was denounced as a heretic, as a blasphemer. There was a threat of mob action. They're going to smash his windows and stuff. And the entire controversy was so fierce. And this was around the same time as Emerson's Divinity School address. There was a lot of reaction now against the progressivism of Transcendentalists from more conservative Unitarians and so forth. And the controversy over Conversations on the Gospels essentially sank his teaching career. Parents pulled children out of the school. He was down to a very small group, but was still going to make a go of it. And then along came a family called the Robinsons. And the Robinsons said, please, Mr. Alcott, will you accept our little daughter, Susan, into your school? And he said, absolutely. The problem was Susan Robinson and her parents were black. And when Bronson enrolled a black child in this very forward-looking progressive school, the forward-looking progressive parents of the white children came to Bronson and said, either Susan Robinson goes or we go. And Bronson had the courage to say, see you later, Susan Robinson stays.
And they were the paying parents, and Susan Robinson was what they'd call a charity pupil.
Yeah.
And you have to also keep in mind that even though some of these parents were some of the staunch abolitionist families as well, they did not believe that those black slaves were really fully human. They were above the animals, but certainly not human. So you don't want your child in school with someone that's not fully human. Free them. We'll work hard to free them, but we don't want them having this sense of being equal with us. But Bronson felt they were completely equal. Very shocking, very upsetting. And he kept doing things like this again and again and again all through his life.
And that's one of those absolutes, I think, that you see in him, that he was absolute about that, as you said.
It's interesting because when you look at those things, the teaching principles and the abolitionist ideas and such, yes, but when you look at the philosophical part, I agree with you. You can't find it there, but you find it in his actions.
Yeah.
And Emerson once said something about that. They said, Emerson once said, Alcott more fully lives out what the rest of us philosophers say and talk about. So.
Well, Amanda, did you want to read that quotation that was referred to, the tribute of Eddy to Alcott?
When the light of one friendship after another passes from earth to heaven, we kindle in place thereof the glow of some deathless reality. Memory, faithful to goodness, holds in her secret chambers those characters of holiest sort, bravest to endure, firmest to suffer, soonest to renounce. Such was the founder of the Concord School of Philosophy, the late A. Bronson Alcott. After the publication of Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, his athletic mind, scholarly and serene, was the first to bedew my hope with a drop of humanity. When the press and pulpit cannonaded this book, he introduced himself to its author by saying, "I have come to comfort you." Then, eloquently paraphrasing it and prophesying its prosperity, his conversation with a beauty all its own reassured me. That prophecy is fulfilled.
That's beautiful. Wow. Well, we really do have to wind up. Did you have a very quick question or comment that you could share, and then we'll...
I'm a senior in high school, and thinking, about college next year and a whole bunch of things that I have to do. Was wondering, maybe going into education, maybe music, and seeing Bronson's view on education. I was just wondering, do you think that another model of education kind of formed after what he was talking about could possibly, exist or even, be successful in the time we live in now?
There is a woman in France right now doing exactly what you just described, and if you see me afterwards, I will get your information and put you in touch with her. She was actually one of our speakers in the School of Philosophy series that Lisa referred to earlier, our summer conversational series that we have every summer. I think you should definitely be in touch with her.
I think your point is very well taken, that we live in an age that increasingly uses the standardized test, a rubric. I mean, I see this as a parent of, I have kids that kind of span the age from 21 down to 11, and I see elementary schools, I think, in some ways becoming more retrogressive, more like those schools that Bronson was kind of railing against, that cut into time for the arts, that cut into time for music, because that's not important. We need to focus on math and science, and whereas I certainly agree that those things are important, I think we're in danger of losing that little child in some ways, or that kind of spirit that Alcott had, that the child sometimes leads you, and that your job as a teacher is not always to cram knowledge, but to kind of help the child figure out where they want to go as you're trying to discern now kind of where you want to go. And a good teacher, I think, is a combination of that helps to guide a student, but also respects that a student has their own sense of at least where they think they want to go. And I think I'm a little concerned myself, quite frankly, about public schooling today. I think we're losing a little. I think we could learn a lot from Alcott to be reminded of that, and certainly the teachings of both Alcott and Eddy on childhood.
Only public, Lisa?
Yeah.
There are some private schools I could introduce you to as well.
Yeah.
Like the one whose headmaster, when my daughter was in 4th grade, called my wife and me in to say that, Rebecca wasn't as keyed into current culture as she should be, and she ought to be watching more American Idol.
So there you have it from the panel of experts, whatever we know, parents.
The only words that I have for you, what's your name? Kirby. The only words that I have for you are those of encouragement. If you are actually able to get out there and to create an educational environment that supplies the necessary information and the necessary skills, but also at the same time exalts and respects and glorifies the individuality of the child. Bronson talks a lot about the word genius, and he doesn't necessarily mean Albert Einstein. What Bronson meant by the word genius was that individual, different spark that everybody's got, and that you need to find, and you need to cultivate, and you need to cherish. Very hard to find an educational environment where that takes place. It's part of what Lisa was talking about. With a standardized test, we teach to the test. We teach to the middle of the class, not to the kids who are struggling, not to the kids who are bored, but right smack down the middle, because standardization is the way to go. Recipe for disaster, okay? Seek the individual, celebrate the individual, and you'll be doing a great service for all of us.
And I thought of a second person I want to introduce you to. You've got to talk to me.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jen. It's really been wonderful sharing, and I'm glad you didn't watch TV or American Idol and came here tonight. As John indicated, his book is for sale out in the lobby. It's cash or check only, I'm afraid, but and the checks would need to be made out to Orchard House. Orchard House has kindly provided us an inventory since things went awry with our order. But this conversation is going to continue with our webcast on Thursday afternoon, October 28th. So please consider that as an opportunity to email in questions and explore these topics further with John and Lisa. Well, again, thanks for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.